want to welcome all of you to the service this morning, and I want to express appreciation to those who are assisting with the service. We have Becky and Shannon who are assisting with the AV, and of course we have Bailey on the organ and piano, and we have the three members of the choir, Magdalene, Linda, and my wife, Mary Jane. So some of you may not realize it, but I have been experiencing, well, I will continue to experience a medical problem. I have a collapsed disc between the vertebra and the lumbar region of my spinal column. This allows two of the vertebral bones to pinch a nerve that goes to my legs. Now, the good thing about the pinched nerve is that it doesn't hurt. It deadens, and I don't have any feeling in my legs below my hips, and that's why I have a little difficulty walking around. But still, I am able to do some things. And this morning, I'd like to share with you a sermon on choices. We all come to points in our lives where we have to make choices. And the choice we make can make a difference. When I graduated from high school, my father expected me to go to work at the United States Postal Service, just as he had done when he finished high school. I chose to go to college. When I graduated from college and seminary, I could have stayed in Texas. I chose to serve a Methodist church in Kansas. After 5 years, I could have stayed in Kansas. I chose to move to New York to go to Syracuse University and become a psychologist for the Hamburg schools. After she graduated from high school, Mary Jane could have stayed in Prattsburg, New York. How many of you heard of Prattsburg? A few of you. It's a very small town near Bath and on the western edge of the upper New York Hawaiian region. Anyway, she could have stayed in Prattsburg and gotten married as many of her classmates did. She chose to go to college and become a teacher. She chose to return to Prattsburg, get married, and become a math teacher in her old high school. When her husband became disabled by a heart condition, she chose to apply for a teaching position in Sweet Home High School and to move her family to Buffalo, where he could get better medical care. After 22 years in the classroom, she chose to obtain a certificate of advanced study. For those who are not familiar with this, it's basically a doctoral dissertation without the dissertation. And she accepted a position as assistant principal at Hamburg High School. Both of our spouses died in 1995 following long chronic illnesses. In 1996, having been acquainted as colleagues for 7 years, we chose each other to be partners in marriage. Over the years, we each came to decision points in our lives, and we made good choices. Choices that eventually brought a Texas boy and a small town New York girl together. Something that neither of us had ever imagined in our wildest dreams. There are some people who believe that there is a God out there somewhere who has a plan for every person's life from birth to death. They would say that each person, at each decision at some point, we're living out the life that God has planned for us. And they would base their belief on their reading and understanding of the Bible. Now let me say, as clearly, as emphatically as I can, I do not believe that there is a God out there that has a plan for every person's life. And I base my belief on my reading of the Bible. Since I don't read Hebrew or Greek, my understanding is based on reading the work of numerous biblical, historical, and theological scholars whose integrity and scholarship I trust. The lectionary reading from the Hebrew Scriptures today is from Genesis 45, 1 through 15. It is a brief portion of a rather long story about the beginnings of the Israelites and their religious beliefs, known today as the Jews and Judaism. When we read the book of Genesis, it looks like history, but it is not history as we understand history today. We are reading a collection of stories and traditions that have been woven together from a dozen or more different tribes or clans in order to unify them into one nation and one religion. Most of the book of Genesis was composed between 1000 and 950 BCE. The stories reflect traditions that originated 600 to 1,000 years earlier. In other words, somewhere around 2000 BCE. However, Chamber of the, I'll get it in a minute. Chapter 1, the creation story, was added just after the Babylonian exile, sometime around 500 BCE. Read chapters 1 and 2, both, sometime. Both are creation stories. But the second chapter is 1,000 years older than the first chapter. There are many different genres of literature in the Bible: poetry, parable, metaphor, myth, and legend, to mention a few. The reading today from Genesis is part of an extended legend. A legend usually begins as an oral tradition based on an historical but unverifiable incident. The part of the story that you heard today focuses on a man named Joseph. He was the youngest of 12 sons of Jacob, and he was his father's favorite son. The 11 older brothers, being jealous, got together and conspired to sell Joseph to a caravan that was traveling to Egypt. And they told Jacob, Joseph's father, that he had been attacked and killed by a dangerous animal. When Joseph arrived in Egypt, people discovered, particularly the Pharaoh, that he had the ability to interpret dreams. And he became a member of Pharaoh's court and rose to a position of great power. A great famine struck Egypt and Palestine, but due to Joseph's foresight, Egypt had stored up plenty of grain In order to survive, Joseph's brothers were forced to go down to Egypt from Palestine in order to buy food. Joseph had responsibility for distributing the grain, so they had to deal with him. Joseph, of course, recognized his 11 brothers immediately, but they did not recognize him. After all, he had been a pre-teenager when they sold him into to a caravan going to Egypt. And now he was a grown man. It looked much different. The main part of this legend is a moral value. Joseph could have sought revenge on his brothers. He could have refused to sell them any grain. He could have thrown them in prison. Instead, he chose to forgive them. He chose to give them food and arrange for them and his father Jacob to move to Egypt. Forgiveness triumphed over revenge. Secondly, this story reflects incidents that may have occurred between 1700 and 1600 BCE and set the stage for an eventual exodus, which is dated between 1200 and 1300 BCE. Historically speaking, scholars are reasonably certain that these stories were first committed to parchment around 950 BCE, during or shortly after the reign of King David. Thus, most of the content of Genesis and Exodus is based on oral traditions, which is another term for legends, stories about the past, and stories about events or persons that cannot be verified. There is a reason why the first books of the Pentateuch were written during the time of King David. In the latter half of the second millennium BCE, a number of Semitic tribes were wandering around the edges of the Arabian desert with their herds of cattle. Then between about 1500 BC and 1100 BCE, several of these tribes began to move west into an area between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, an area that was known as Canaan. Mary Jane and I have been to Palestine, Israel. We've met descendants of the people who were in Canaan when the Israelites moved in. And they remember their tradition well. And it's possible that there was one tribe or clan that came from Egypt, which gave rise to the story of Exodus. When this loose federation of tribes came under attack from neighboring tribes, notably the Moabites and the Philistines, a man named Saul rallied men from the various tribes to form an army to defeat the attackers. While he is known as King Saul, he functioned more as an army general than as a king. And while he was known as King Saul, he was killed in a battle. One of his commanders, a man named David, stepped forward to assume control and meld the tribes into a kingdom or a nation and become their king. The book of Genesis, from chapter 12 to the end, was written to unify these tribes under David's rule. Unfortunately, those chapters contain two major fallacies, and I can't emphasize that strongly enough. First, God did not choose Abraham and his descendants, the Hebrews or the Israelites, to be his chosen people. As we could understand God in the 21st century, God is the God of all people. God does not choose one people, one nation, or one religion to be God's special people. All humanity is special to God. A second fallacy is that God gave the land between the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan River, between Dan in the north and Beersheba in the south, to belong to his chosen people. Newsflash: God is not, never was, and never will be in the real estate business. Yet those two fallacies contribute to the continued unrest and conflict in the Middle East to this day. Overlooked and forgotten is the main point of the Joseph story. In order to reduce conflict and establish peace, it is necessary to forgive. Seeking revenge only perpetuates the conflict and the violence. The tribes that were coming together to form the kingdom of David, the kingdom of Israel, had fought each other in the past, and they needed to hear a message of forgiveness. It is a message our nation and our world needs to hear today. We need to choose cooperation and compromise, forgiveness and peace. The reading from the New Testament for today was from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 15. And it contained two pericopes, two stories challenging two principal beliefs of the Jewish religion. The first incident presents a clear rejection of the dietary laws of the Holiness Code. Among other things, the Holiness Code forbade the eating of pork or shellfish. If people ate any of these kinds of food, it made them unclean, and they had to perform acts of purification. Radical that he was, Jesus rejected that kind of religiosity. He pointed out emphatically that it is not what goes into a person's mouth, not what he eats, that makes them unclean. It is what comes out of a person's mouth that makes them unclean. What comes out of a person's mouth comes from the heart, from the mind, from the brain. For several years now, there's been a coarsening of civil discourse in our nation. Persons on both the left and the right, politically speaking, have engaged in name-calling and blaming each other for the conflicts in our nation and in the world today. All the racial slurs, the anti-Muslim rhetoric in recent years have contributed to acts of violence. In South Carolina, 9 people in a prayer group meeting in an African American Methodist church were murdered. In Wisconsin, several Muslims were shot and killed as they were leaving their mosque after services. And several mosques across the nation have been burned down by arsonists. There have been a number of rallies in recent years where white supremacists, also known as Christian nationalists, have come together to promote white supremacy and to denigrate persons of color or of other cultures or other religious beliefs. The second half of the reading from Matthew is the story of a Canaanite woman who approached Jesus and asked him to heal her daughter who was ill. Jesus replied, "My mission is to the lost sheep of Israel. It is not right to take their bread and throw it to the dogs." That was quite an insult. But the woman persisted. "That's true," she replies, "but even dogs eat the scraps that fall from the master's table." Now she had Jesus' full attention. He replied, "Woman, what faith you have. Be it as you wish." And from that moment, her daughter was healed. There's no way to prove the historicity of any of these stories. They cannot be authenticated by any independent source. But the truth they convey is self-evident. When his brothers came to Joseph, he could have sought revenge. Instead, he chose to offer forgiveness. Forgiveness, not revenge, is the path to reconciliation and peace. Words have consequences. What comes out of our mouths, not what goes in, is what determines the kinds of persons we are. We can choose to speak words of kindness, words of encouragement and support, words of comfort and compassion, words that are helpful and supportive to others. Or we can choose to speak words that are hateful and incendiary, words that arouse violence and a desire for revenge in others. We have heard too much of the latter in recent times, and we have witnessed an increase in hateful and hurtful acts. Jesus' mission and message is one of inclusion. It includes all people, all nationalities, all races, all religions, and all sexual orientations. As followers of Jesus, we are charged to be forgiving, to speak words of kindness and reconciliation, and to be accepting and inclusive in our interactions with others. The choices are ours to make. We can choose to follow the crowd or choose to follow the example of Jesus. When wronged or hurt, we can choose to seek revenge and do harm in return. Or we can choose to forgive and to heal. We can choose to spread lies, to slander, to blame, and to revile. Or we can choose to speak words of truth, words of love, compromise, comfort, and affirmation. We can choose to exclude others who are different, who have different color of skin, different nationality, or espouse different religious beliefs. We can build walls to shut others out. Or we can choose to be inclusive, to strive to see life from another's perspective, to understand different beliefs, and to be accepting and affirming of others. The choice is ours to make. The choice is ours alone.